I wanted to go ahead and introduce myself. I am Sheila Carter-Todd. I'm the Executive Director of the University Writing Program. And I am so happy that you all are all here. This is something we do annually, and it has, I've only been here 2 years, but it's been really cool for the 2 years I've been here, and I heard that it was equally as cool previous years. I wanted to say a few thank yous. I want to thank Amanda Thompson, who is our program manager and has helped organize a lot of the details and the food, the things that you all are having. I'd also like to give a special thank you and a shout out to Camilla Kenyon, who has notified all the people. She's up here, y'all will see her in a minute, but she coordinated this, she helped come up with themes, she helped arrange for things. I'd like to thank Richard Colby, who will be filming it so that it'll be up on the site, so you'll be able to see that. And I also wanted to thank Celine Hatterley, who will be doing our social media. So there is a site, there is something they could, if you want to tweet during the event, you can do that as well. And we welcome the opportunity for you to do that. Many of you are here by incentive, I know, from your writing teachers. And the cool thing about it is sometimes that which has been incentivized can also be really fun. So I'm just that kind of evil person that I have this plan that in the closing, there will be a word. And in that word, if you have that word, when you send your note to your faculty to let you know you attended, at the end, you will get the word. Some of you will say, wait, I'm going to leave early and ask my friend for the word. No. So you will wait till the end, you'll get your word, and you will be so in for whatever the incentive was. Okay? I think that's about it for my welcomes. I'm now going to turn it over to Jennifer Karras, the Senior Vice Provost for Academic Affairs, just because I did not want to mess that up, who will be doing a welcome, and also she'll then turn it over to Camilla Kenyon, who will introduce our panel. And I also want to thank you all so much for being here as well. Thank you.
Okay. Re-welcome you, so please feel re-welcomed. And I want to thank you all for being here. And I want to thank all my colleagues in the writing program, especially my esteemed colleague Dr. Sheila Carter-Todd, who you just heard from, and Camilla Kenyon, who has graciously, year after year, organized this event. And I want to thank our panelists for being here. And I also want to thank the students. And again, I know you were, as she said, incentive, but coerced into being here. Last year at this event, you all had, the students at this event had the most amazing questions. I was stunned by the insights. And Megan has a question? Oh, no, we're just talking amongst ourselves here. That's really good. That's really great. So providing such insight, I really appreciate that. So now I'm going to just think a little bit, meditate a little bit on writing across the disciplines. And so some of the writing faculty know, but many of you don't, that I actually, I'm a sociologist, so many of you don't know that, but I actually taught writing across the disciplines when I was in graduate school, so that was hilarious. Writing has always had a really, and teaching writing has always been a big part of what I love to do. But as you know, writing takes place in a community, and on the DU campus, we have many communities, and we kind of organize into weird departments or programs or fields or sometimes disciplines, we call them that. And each of those includes its own writing processes as well as its own genres, and I'm thrilled tonight that we're going to hear from quite a few. So given the way that we've constructed this at DU and many other places, it's impossible for any writing course, including the stellar first-year writing courses that we have here at the University of Denver, to completely prepare students for all of the kinds of writings they'll need to do and do well in college, and then in your lives beyond. But unlike courses in the writing program, solely strengthening the writing skills is not the primary goal of writing in disciplinary courses, but it is a desired outcome. As faculty, we all want our students to become better writers. So students need more practice writing than our 2 written courses can give them. And when students write in many classes, so that's the good news, you'll be writing in many classes across your 4 years, you'll develop and maintain good written communication skills. And so every academic discipline requires some kind of writing, and most of them require it frequently, even math. Students at DU must not only write often and well, but they also must write in multiple disciplines. and each requiring different standards and expectations. And so these kinds of tasks will ask you to think about the kind of writing that you've done previously and think about what from that do you want to carry forward as you're learning to write and to think as a scholar in a different discipline in that new setting. So first and most importantly, writing is a way of learning, right? Writing helps us think through the ideas and concepts in a given situation and gives us kind of ownership of that information. It's through writing it kind of becomes our own. And secondly, frequent writing tasks actually help us improve our writing through practice. That's right, writing is a practice. You're never finished. Writing is always a practice. So writing disciplines help us learn to think like a scholar, an historian, an anthropologist, a sociologist, and among others. Also, I think our faculty know that they reap benefits from asking students to write and write often in their classes. Faculty teaching writing in their disciplinary courses create a community that crosses disciplinary boundaries. Faculty from all over campus work together to share ideas, ideally, and strategies for improving learning through writing, and they allow us to have conversations like the one that we'll have here tonight. So, I'm curious to learn, and I hope tonight that we learn from this impressive panel as they tell us how they've developed, not just as scholars, but as writers in their fields. And I'm curious to learn about the different kinds of writing they've had to learn and continue to learn as they progressed in their fields and their careers. So thank you again for being here. It's week 4, or as we like to say, week 14, right? So there's no break, or maybe 15 because you count what was supposed to be our spring break, but is really never enough. It's tiring, and I know, but it's worth it. So I'm glad you're here. And so with that, I'd like to turn the stage over to Kelly.
All right, well, thank you everybody for coming to Conversations in the Disciplines, and I'd really like to thank Sheila Carter, Todd, and Amanda Thompson and others for helping put this event together. The writing program has hosted this event for over 15 years. You know, we find that it's a great way to find out about the research and writing that faculty across campus are doing. So if you're here for a research writing class, this panel can really give you some insight into the assignments you're doing in that class, whether they're text-based, interpretive, qualitative, quantitative, mixed methods. And after the speakers finish their presentations, we'll have a more informal discussion, and you can also ask questions. So I'd like to introduce our 4 speakers. We're going to start with a presentation by Professor Kelly Fayard, who is an indigenous anthropologist who has done extensive research about the Porch Band of Creek Indians from an insider's perspective. And then this will be followed by a talk by Professor Reginald Byron, who's a sociologist and the director of the Critical Race and Ethnic Studies program. His research centers on institutional critiques of gender and ethnic discrimination. And after that, we'll hear from Elizabeth Escobedo, professor at the History Department. She has studied the role of Mexican American and Puerto Rican women in the U.S. military and has written a book that has been made into 2 PBS documentaries, specifically about Mexican American women in World War II. And then finally, we'll hear from Lina Rzezniczek Parado, who is an applied sociolinguist, and she is the founding director of the Spanish Bilingual Heritage Speakers, and several of my students have had great things to say about these classes. So to begin, could you please welcome Dr. Kelly Fayard. Thank you.
There was a debate among the panelists about whether or not this conversation is in the discipline or across the discipline. For my talk, it's across. I think for Grady's, it's in. So anyway, So thank you so much for that welcome. I really appreciate it, and I'm glad to be here. I'm going to talk a little bit about spite, because I have what I refer to as a spite PhD. And it has to do with the fact that I am from a tribal community in a rural part of Alabama, and since the 1960s, there had been an anthropologist named J. Anthony Paredes who came to my community. I grew up knowing this guy. So when I was an undergrad, I did my undergrad at Duke, go Blue Devils, I decided in my Native North American class to write specifically about my tribe. So of course that meant looking up Paredes' work and reading it and getting angry only with the energy of an undergrad, and being really mad at what I found in his research. So I went to my advisor and I said, you know, what can I do to write against this guy? And he says, well, you gotta get a PhD in anthropology. And I was like, anthropology sucks. I did not want a PhD in anthropology. What about Native studies? And he was like, yeah, anthropologists don't read Native studies, so if you specifically want to get this guy, you have to get a PhD in anthropology. So that's what I did. I graduated with my PhD from the University of Michigan, and then really have spent my entire career making sure that the anthropology that I teach is not the kind that Paredes reproduced. Which, by the way, he was trained in the 1950s in the University of New Mexico, and so that was like a very particular time period that is the dark times of anthropology. Most of them are dark, actually. So after I got out of grad school, I just wanted to make sure I wasn't replicating that kind of othering. And I wanted to make sure that the research that I was doing would be helpful to my community. So what that meant was that when I started my field work, even though I was doing field work in the place that I grew up, and even though I was doing field work in many cases with people that I grew up with, my family, my friends, I still did a listening tour to figure out what people wanted me to write about and what they wanted researched, just to make sure that what I wanted was in line with what they wanted and that we could work together. So I did a lot of interviews, I did some archival research, and I also did participant observation. So in anthropology, if you don't know, participant observation is what we call deep hanging out, which means that you just hang out and write down what you see. You hang out and maybe you do a little analysis, but it's mostly just making observations and actually participating in daily life. So what that meant for me was I went to all the tribal council meetings, I went to language classes, I did all these kinds of things as part of that research. But when we're in anthropology, a lot of times we talk about field work. But what I was actually doing was homework, because I did do this research there. And I'm also a citizen of the Porch Panther Creek Indians, so this really was my community that I was working with. And in case you needed to know, that's Paredes up there in the top left, and this is just a picture of me with my mom and my grandmother. Because one of the things that I was really interested in doing is really delving into indigenous feminisms as a way to think differently about the methods that we use in anthropology. So a lot of the interviews that I did were at my grandmother's table. And it was really great because then she could say, hey, tell her about that time that blank happened, or hey, what about that other thing that, that other detail that you forgot to say. And so it was it was an interesting sort of method for me to use as I started doing the research for my dissertation. But also I had a very different perspective doing anthropology with the community that I grew up with. So even though, a lot of anthropologists, they go out, they publish, they might return, but these are people that I'm still going to be seeing for the rest of my life. Every time I have a break, I go home. This is really where, when I talk about going home, I'm talking about Porch, I'm not talking about Denver. And so it was really important to me to get it right. But it also means that it is a little scary sometimes to publish that research because I'm constantly afraid that somebody's going to be mad at me. And not just anybody, but like a Porch community member. So I really want to make sure, and I really strive to make sure that I'm doing things really ethically and that I'm also doing something that the community will be proud of and that they will recognize in my work. But I also have some trolls. I legit have people who wait until I publish something and send me nasty letters, little nasty grams, because of the nature of the research, which I'll get to in a little bit. So my main research contributions have to do with identity and Native identity. So recently there's been a lot of talk about pretendians, specifically in the academy. And in Canada, if you pretend like you're a Native person and then you are found out not to be, they fire you. This is something that I have seen happen a lot in the last year or two. In the United States, when you get outed as a pretendian, it's totally fine. And you can continue on your way and still have your job at the end of the day. So just keep that in mind. But I just want to know, like, how are people deciding who belongs and who doesn't in these communities? And part of that has to do with DNA testing and the way in which we think about identity at this point. Because you probably know somebody who's done a 23andMe and has come up with like a 10% Native American blood or something like that. And how does that add to somebody's identity if they start claiming a Native identity without having a connection to a community? But really I'm concerned about porch identity because that's where I'm from, that's what this research is about. And porch identity has a little bit to do with casinos. Okay, so when I started my research, I did not want to talk about casinos. Somebody already did that. Jessica Catalina wrote a great book about casinos, focusing on the Seminole of Florida. But I started my field work the exact same month that the casino opened in Porch. And it opened to a lot of fanfare. It's been very successful. From that casino, we now get per capita checks, which means that every tribal member who is enrolled gets a check. Thank God, because we can't afford to live in Denver with DU's salary. Then you can get some other kinds of benefits like insurance, scholarships, those types of things, and even debt benefits, so they'll pay for your funeral, things like that. So as this is happening, people are reminiscing a lot about times before the casino. It was a very poor community, ostracized from other communities. But education was always really important, and the Porch community only had a school that went up to the 6th grade. So even though Brown v. Board of Education passed in the 1950s, my mom, who was born in 1954, went to an all-Indian school until the 6th grade. And so there was still that issue of integration happening with Porch Creeks and the local white schools that went all the way to the 12th grade. So long after this sort of integration was supposed to happen, there was still a lot of discrimination happening in the public schools. So Porch Creeks were discriminated against in a similar way to black students at the time, and were really ostracized. But what happens after the casino opens and people find out that there is a way to get per caps is that everybody then wants to sign up to be Porch Creek. So even people who had not, or even people who had participated in that discrimination when students were integrating the high school, those were the exact people who came looking for a handout. And some of the people who were doing that did actually have Porch Creek relatives, but because they had kind of participated in that discrimination, racism in schools, people were not happy seeing them around Porch. And because of this, the community started referring to these folks by different names. So BG and AG is before gaming and after gaming. BC, AC is before casino, after casino. And then my favorite is the 3000s, because this is really Porch specific, because our tribal roll number, my tribal roll number starts with a 1000. My mom starts with a 0, so she's still in the hundreds. But anybody who had petitioned to be put on the roll after the casino opened, their roll number started with the number 3000. And so anytime people were talking about the 3000s, it was a derogatory comment towards the people who were now trying to express Native identity, specifically to be able to sort of capitalize on that. So I'm really interested in belonging and the way in which these folks attempt to belong to the Porch community. I'm really interested in how the Porch Creek tried to belong in a local context. So in the closest municipality is a town called Atmore, Alabama. And so the way in which Porch has negotiated belonging with that group. I'm also very interested in how Porch negotiates belonging in the state, specifically because when George Wallace was blocking the doors of the University of Alabama for black students to attend, he was taking pictures with his arm around our chief, calling them my Indians. So, you know, the way in which the state dynamic plays out is really interesting, specifically because, you know, the good old boy white Southern network that has been around in that state, but then also thinking about the national. And so that was a lot of things I just threw at you. I try to give you the big concepts, but I want to now show you some of the public relations campaigns that my tribe has done in an effort to sort of belong more in these contexts. So I have a couple that I'll just play for you really quick.
We are Orange Creek Indians. Here our ancestors walked, worked, moved, looked, shed tears, and shared joy. They were guides, loggers, sharecroppers, innovators. Through hardships, they journeyed forward, believing that self-reliance makes community strong. Every day, we retrace the steps of moms, dads, grannies, and cousins. Their wisdom echoes in our footsteps. A thriving community builds a better life for all. Our future tells us so.
So as you can kind of see with that one, there's this real sort of need to show how porch is helping the state of Alabama. So even the website is called Porch Neighbors. And so there's this real push to make sure that people understand that the benefits of the tribe also benefit the rest of the state.
We are the Orange Creek Indians. We are part of Alabama's ancient history. We love our home. We cherish our neighbors. Welcome to our home, Porch Neighbors.
All right, I have one more short one, and then I'm going to leave you alone. But
without the help of the tribe, Alabama Children First could have been gone, just like that.
The Porch Creek Indians have made significant inroads into all of the communities in Alabama.
They're the only really recognized tribe in the state of Alabama.
They do own casinos, but they do more than that.
They are a major economic force in our community. They have done miraculous things, almost from zero.
They know what it is to suffer. They understand that you have to help the least and the lost.
The Porch Band of Creek Indians, they are givers.
The 4-year-old kid that has cerebral palsy that gets his first power wheelchair.
Fire prevention, fire suppression.
We're able to create jobs.
We all share those problems, and we all have to become a part of that solution.
That's what being good neighbors is all about.
all right, so the book manuscript I'm working on now is all about sort of the history of Porch and the way in which the casino affects current tribal members. My next project is going to be about PR campaigns. So, thank you.
All right, hello everyone. Thank you all for coming and spending your evening with us. Okay. So, as was mentioned, my name is Dr. Reggie Byron. I am the brand new Director of Critical Race and Ethnic Studies here at DU. I'm also an Associate Professor of Sociology. And so I actually want to begin by talking a little bit about my scholarship. And you'll see in the public accommodations box some lettering that's purple, and that's basically how I do my writing, right? And we'll return to that at the end. But I consider myself an inequality scholar, and I study typically racial and gender inequalities in these 4 domains: in the domain of employment, in higher education, the criminal justice system, and then public accommodations. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time today talking about some of my recent work in public accommodations. And as you can see there are 4 words: history, law, sociology, and statistics. And so this is the way I think about writing, right? So typically when I write, I start with a little segment on history, the history of whatever phenomena I'm studying. I talk about the law. I oftentimes use a legal framework to try to understand, where we were and where we are now. I infuse sociology as a sociologist. That's almost natural. And then to the extent that it's necessary, I will include statistics, right, to support my argument. So when we think about the history of racial discrimination in public accommodations, it's important for us to know that there was a time in American history where racial discrimination was rampant. And racial discrimination in public accommodation starts before the Jim Crow era, right? It's important for us to know that, but I'm just giving us this period so we have a context to understand where we were and then ultimately where we are now. So the Jim Crow era actually took place between the 1870s and 1964. During this period in America, we had what was called de jure discrimination in the U.S. South. And so in the U.S. South, discrimination was written into law. And oftentimes in the South, you would see some of the images that you see up on the screen here. So restaurants and hotels and bathrooms, etc., were all segregated. And they all had signs that clearly denoted that people of color were not welcome in these spaces. It's important for us to recognize that in the North, there was also systemic segregation, right? It wasn't necessarily written into law, but it was true in practice. And so this form of segregation is called de facto segregation. And so collectively, these forms of segregation led individuals of color to do things to try to make themselves get by in these circumstances. And so one person is a man by the name of Victor Green, who wrote the Negro Motorist Green Book. And so this Green Book was basically a guide for people of color to navigate the spaces, right? So they could know which restaurants, which hotels, etc. Were going to accept their patronage. Fast forward a bit. 1964, most of you, when we think about 1964, we think about the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And a lot of times when we think about the Civil Rights Act, we think about Title VII. Title VII pertains to employment, and so essentially protects individuals from employment discrimination. A lesser known title of the Civil Rights Act is Title II, and Title II pertains to public accommodations. And so Title II protects individuals as they're going into hotels and banks and whatnot from racial discrimination. So what we know is that we had this sort of period of overt, really problematic discrimination, and then we had this major piece of legislation, right? So it seems like we're making progress. One of the things that we think about when we think about the sociological literature is some common misunderstandings when we fast forward to contemporary times. And 2 enduring misunderstandings of racial inequality. One is that discrimination is still largely blamed on individual racist people. And so when we think about the sort of cancel culture, when we think about the Karen and Ken memes, when we think about the hashtags, right, for individuals who have engaged in racist behavior, oftentimes that's where we leave the story. But one of the things that I try to do as sociologists is look at the more organizational or institutional foundations of racial inequality. So it's not just about individuals. There are things that are broader than individuals that are actually bringing us to this point of racial inequality. Another thing that we do, unfortunately, still is that many mistakenly assume that racial progress is linear, right? So if we go from the Jim Crow era, we have this major piece of legislation, people assume that things are just getting better and better and better, even though we have a host of evidence to suggest otherwise, right? So when we think about 9/11, for example, the experience of Arab Americans in the United States pre and post 9/11 was drastically different, right? So we had this example of terrorism being something that changes the way that race relations happens in the United States. You can also think about elections, right? And we know the election of former President Donald Trump was something that changed the way that race relations happened, especially as it pertained to Mexican Americans, right? So we know that sort of as we're moving forward in time, oftentimes what happens with racial relations is sometimes they backslide, right? They go backwards, so it's not linear. So I'm going to talk a little bit about two of my recent publications. One I published in December of last year, and then one is forthcoming. So the first one is in the journal Sociology of Race and Ethnicity, and it's titled Organizational Directives and the Persistence of Racial Discrimination in U.S. Public Accommodations. And again, as I said a minute ago, one of the things that I try to do in these publications is I try to understand the sociological foundation of some of these issues of inequality. And then the second piece that I'm just going to show a graph very briefly is titled Race and Contemporary Perceptions of Public Accommodations Inequality, and that's forthcoming in this journal called Context. So for the first paper, the Organizational Directives paper, what I did is I did what's called a content analysis. And so with the content analysis, what you do is you gather a whole bunch, typically of textual data, even though content analyses can also be done on programs, like TV programs or audio recordings. But in this case, it was textual data. So I gathered this data from making FOIA requests, so Freedom of Information Act requests, to 35 city-level civil rights commissions across the United States. So, as I'll say here, I only received data from 51%, or 18 of the 35 commissions. But nonetheless, this data comes in the form of texts, right? So they send you these files. And so typically what you do with content analysis is you read through the files, and then you reread through the files, and your goal is to try to figure out what themes exist within those files. So as I said, I tried to get this data from 35 city-level commissions, but only 18 granted me access to the data. Nonetheless, this data accounted for about 3,000 pages of data. The other states and cities that I was denied access, they were clustered in the south and the non-coastal west, right? And so we think about Colorado was one of the states that denied me access. It's important for us to understand these skews, right? Especially when we think about racial discrimination, in part because some of these locations may have a reason to hide their data from researchers. Nonetheless, I received data from 18 cities, and so you can see a representation here. It might be difficult for you to see, but Portland, San Francisco, Atlanta, Austin, Texas, Vermont, etc., right? So it was a pretty widespread selection that I received, even though I didn't receive the full 35. One of the things that, one of the primary themes that came as a result of these data is what I call the organizational locus of inequality. And so as I said earlier, one of the mistakes that we make when we're thinking about contemporary racial discrimination is we tend to continue to attribute it to individuals. One thing that I found in these data is that only about 15% of the cases in the case material revealed that individuals were ultimately responsible for the racial discrimination. And in fact, I found that in 85% of the cases, it can be directly traced back to an organizational directive that led an individual to behave in a particular way that then reproduced the racial discrimination. Here are some of the themes, and here are some of the qualitative excerpts that I took and wrote into the paper. So the first theme is it took place in restaurants and food stores, and it's a theme that I call risk minimization. And so it went something like this. Larry Davis, a black New Yorker, requested access to use the bathroom in a coffee shop in 2019. He was in the bathroom for 2 minutes before a black male employee banged on the door yelling, "Get out of there, we have a 10-minute limit." After speaking with the black female manager, she apologized and said the store had a prior issue with black men going into the bathroom to do drugs and drink alcohol. She claimed that there was a 10-minute limit written on the bathroom wall, but there was not, and Larry saw white customers use the bathroom without incident, right? And so here what we have is we have an individual that's responded to an organizational policy that suggests that people should have a limited amount of time in the bathroom, right? So it's not the individual directly, but it's this larger policy that's driving that behavior. Similarly, Graham Alexander, a Native American man in Minneapolis in 2018, expressed a similar story of repeated incidents of a food mini-mart attendant not allowing Native American customers to use the restroom, whereas white customers were permitted to use it freely, right? And so one thing that was surprising about this pattern is I found that even in these public accommodations where you would expect, especially nowadays, equality, people were allowed access to these public accommodations, but yet there was still discrimination in the amenities, right, and what they were allowed access to once they entered these public accommodations. A second theme that I found is the theme of loss prevention, and this is the organizational directive that retail stores operated on. And here are two examples. So Kim Reese, a black woman at a big box retailer in Chicago in 2017, was surveilled while shopping. The case investigation revealed that the loss prevention team saw her on surveillance video and called in a 98 female. By the way, for those of you who don't realize this, sometimes organizations use code so that they don't necessarily say black suspicious female. They'll use a code to sort of get the message to those people who are surveilling the people who are using the establishment. So this was an internal code for a black female exhibiting suspicious behavior. This prompted a Latino male security guard to follow her, and when she entered the self-checkout area, the store video shows him circling her 12 times and displaying his handcuffs on 6 occasions while circling her. The security guard testified that he was directed to do this by his supervisor, but this was not the typical protocol. And again, we have this organizational directive that's driving the behavior. Similarly, Jose Garcia, a Latino man, was followed by 2 Latino security guards upon entering a store on 4 occasions in New York in 2017. An employee told him the reason why they're following you is because they think you're trying to steal something. The company actually said that the security guards are told to be vigilant because there is a methadone clinic nearby, but at no point was Mr. Garcia stopped or confronted. So the company tried to justify this illegal behavior, right? But again, one thing for us to recognize is that these directives are coming down from the company and the individual employees are just acting on the impulse to follow those directives. A third and final example is the example of nightclubs. In nightclubs, the organizational directive is public safety, right? So these nightclubs would say things like they said to Stephon Walker, who was an African-American man, and his white friends were wearing similar baseball jerseys and jeans when attempting to enter a nightclub in Minneapolis in 2018. Despite similar clothing, all the white males were allowed in, and the white male bouncer told Stephon that he was denied because his jeans were too baggy, and that they violated the dress code. Stephon's white brother-in-law vouched for him to try to get him into the club to no avail, right? And so he was unsuccessful in getting him into the club. The company in this specific example said that the dress code policy is supported by the city's police department in efforts to keep gang members out and patrons safe. Bouncers themselves have also confessed that they think if you're wearing baggy clothes, you're hiding a weapon or you're going to do something, right? And so again, we see this example of this organizational directive which says we have these dress code policies, and if people are wearing certain types of clothing, you should keep them out of the establishment because of public safety issues. And then we have individuals who follow those organizational directives. As I said earlier, one thing that I try to do with my qualitative work is I try to complement it with statistics. A statistical complement to this paper that I just talked about is my forthcoming paper, in which I run what's called a regression analysis, and I'll be happy to answer questions about this if you have questions in the Q&A. It's a rather complicated statistical analysis, but nonetheless it's an analysis where you can look at the effect of independent variables on dependent variables controlling for a whole host of other independent variables. And so what I did is I used the General Social Survey, which is a survey that's produced every 2 or 3 years, and one that's used commonly by sociologists, to look at what the general public, and it's a nationally representative sample, what the general public in the United States perceives of public accommodations discrimination. And sadly, what I found was, in 2021, it was the first year that Asian Americans joined African Americans in reporting statistically significant mistreatment in U.S. public accommodations. And so if you look at the data in 2018, there was no difference between Asian Americans and white Americans, but by 2021, there was a statistical significant difference, and it was one that they joined African Americans in having a negative experience of their, or a negative reaction to their experience in public accommodations. And one thing that I link this to is I link this to the pandemic. And we know as a result of the pandemic, the experience of being Asian American in the United States has changed dramatically, and I feel that this has taken place specifically in public accommodations. We have a lot of anecdotal evidence to support this, and this is one of the first studies to support this quantitatively. Okay, so my writing strategy. So I gave you a little gist of some of my research. One of the things that I have to do, especially because I have these 4 domains that I'm interested in, is I have to constantly read the literature to examine what I call pieces of the puzzle. As a broad inequality scholar, I view all of these as individual pieces to try to understand what's going on in society. This literature also helps me to uncover themes, and then also to identify gaps. So where does the literature have holes, and what gaps can I try to fill in the literature? I also, in the process of writing, keep an electronic record of writing ideas. And if you look on my desktop, if I were to sort of remove this, this PowerPoint here, you would see I have lots of folders, and it looks very disorganized, even though it's actually organized to me. So with these folders, I have subfolders, I have files within those subfolders, and that's how I sort of keep track of the things that I'm interested in writing. I also write best in the still of the night. So I'm the type of person that when everything's quiet, when there's nothing on TV, when there's nothing else to do, that's when I write really well. And so I would suggest that you find the time that you write best and work during that time. Also, another thing that is true about my writing style is that I'm the type of writer who starts, stops, and starts again. And that's an iterative process. I do that over and over again. Some other people are far more organized and they pick a particular time of day and they just sort of write during that time. But that's not my writing approach. Nonetheless, through this stopping and starting again, I actually think that the most important thing is persistence, right? You want to get that project over the finish line, and typically doing that is publishing the paper or the piece. Another thing that's important in writing is understanding the shape or formula of empirical papers if you're going to write an empirical paper. And so some people use this hourglass metaphor here, where you can see at the very top, sort of the widest part of your argument is going to be the introduction, right? You're trying to get the reader involved and invested in what you're writing. And then we have your method section, and your results are going to be a smaller part of the paper. And then your discussion and your findings and your implications are going to be a wider part of the paper. And this is the way that typically empirical papers are written. Another thing that I talked about at the very beginning is the pattern that I typically choose to write is I write using a historical framework first, a legal framework if it's appropriate, a sociological framework or perspective, and then ultimately I include statistics if need be. One thing that I'll emphasize is that writing needs to be adapted for specific audiences, and so the 2 publications that I used as an example One was more of a technical piece that I was writing for scholars of race and ethnicity. And so I used specific theories, I used specific concepts. The other piece, however, was more of a generalist piece, and it was a piece that was written for like college students. I wouldn't use that same vernacular. I wouldn't use the same jargon because obviously it's a different audience. So that's something for you to think about. And then the final thing is for you to identify whatever your writing motivation is. And I know as an inequality scholar, my primary motivation is to give voice to those who may not share my various forms of privilege. So even though I'm a black male and I suffer some forms of discrimination, I also have forms of privilege. For example, I have gender privilege. Years ago, I wrote a paper on pregnancy discrimination. Obviously, I will never have the chance to get pregnant, but nonetheless, it was important to me to give the women who were participants in the study a voice in academic circles. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everyone. I too want to echo the sentiments of my colleagues. We thank you all for coming tonight and listening a little bit to our research trajectories and some of the things that we feel particularly passionate about as scholars. And it's also just really fun to be here alongside all of you, some of my favorite people on campus. So I want to begin tonight by telling you a little bit about myself, given that my own individual background very much, like so many of us, informs everything I do in my research. I've always been interested in Mexican American history by and large because this is the story of my family. My mom has Northern and Western European roots, and then on my father's side of the family, his father immigrated from Mexico near the turn of the century, and my grandmother actually had the border cross her. So she and her family lived in present-day Arizona, and her ancestors basically had the world around them shift in the wake of the Mexican-American War, when suddenly they found themselves not living in Mexico, but living in the United States. And growing up, I was always puzzled why I would never see my father's side of the family represented in the historical record. I was fortunate in that my dad and his brothers and sisters loved sharing stories of their lives and their histories, and they really fostered in me a love of history. I went to UCLA as an undergrad, I took women's history classes, I took Chicano studies classes, and yet I was never seeing Chicanas. I was never seeing Mexican American women in that historical record. And so maybe this is a little bit of a spite story too. Like, my family deserves to be in these books. My family deserves to be a part of this collective knowledge. And so the life histories of my aunts, my Aunt Ida and my Aunt Ernie, inspired my first book, From Coveralls to Zoot Suits, The Lives of Mexican American Women on the World War II Home Front. So the story goes like this. During World War II, my uncles had gone off to fight overseas. So we had a strong military service record in that side of the family. My grandmother was a single mother, and my aunts had typically undergone really strict supervision. So they literally were not allowed to go outside the home without a chaperone, a male member of their family on their arm, watching everything they did. And so you can imagine that my aunts were, of course, really worried about their brothers. They wanted them to come home safely. They knew that this was a tremendous sacrifice.
but they also were really, really happy to have some freedom for the first time in their lives. So my aunts were Rosie the Riveters. They went into the World War II defense factory workforce near their East Los Angeles home. They also used that money to buy clothes like this. Now, unfortunately, none of these are my aunts. I do not have a picture of my aunts in a zoot suit, although I do know that my Aunt Ida wore a zoot suit to her high school graduation when her mother had told her that the money she was giving her was for a floral print dress. And she walked across that stage in a zoot suit. This was a really expensive but also really controversial jazz style that a lot of working class youths of color would wear during the World War II era. And it was, as you can see here, a long fingertip coat. Sometimes women would cross-dress and wear a quote-unquote male zoot suit. Other times, young women would wear the scandalously short skirt, which you can see here really just means that it was slightly above the knee. But the public found this presence of young women of color wearing big hair and lots of makeup and a really short skirt highly problematic. Okay, but my aunts wanted to do it anyway. After the war, my aunts continued to work in aerospace and defense industries during the Cold War, by and large because they had gained really significant experience in this industry during World War II. And they both ended up marrying African American men that they had met at a mixed race, progressive LA organization called American Youth for Democracy. So I had grown up hearing these stories. I knew what a transformation the Second World War had made upon the women in the Escobedo family. And yet, as I started trying to understand this experience more broadly, and to see if my aunt's experiences were an anomaly or if this was actually happening to other people, other women who came of age during this time, I ran into the dilemma of how do you actually find sources about historically underrepresented communities who typically are not leaving behind memoirs or making speeches in public, given their lack of access to traditional power structures. What do you do? And so the natural first step for a historian is to go to the written record. Like, I gotta see what's been written during the 1940s about this population. And so I went to newspapers, I went to archival collections in the city of Los Angeles, I looked at Spanish language newspapers, English language newspapers, organizations that had some tangential relationship to Mexican American communities. I looked at federal wartime institutions like the Office of War Information, the Fair Employment Practice Committee. But this research always felt to me like I was looking for a needle in a haystack, because unfortunately, it's not like you go to an archive and you go to the file cabinet and you're like, oh, here's the file on Mexican American women, I'm good. It doesn't work that way, right? You're just looking through file after file that may or may not be relevant. And so I would spend hours going through collections and maybe find one or two references to a Spanish surnamed woman, and then have to look at other sources and try to knit together a larger story. And that can be really frustrating. It can be rewarding, you know, when you really do put those pieces of information together, but it can always also be really frustrating. And a lot of times I was left looking at collections of officials who really didn't have any actual real-world experience with Mexican Americans. And newspapers at the time were especially problematic, okay, given the tremendous anti-Mexican sentiment of the time. So Mexicans were typically considered foreigners, outsiders, in spite of the fact of their longtime presence in the United States. And as I said, those women who wore zoot suits and were often called quote-unquote pachucas, so that was supposed to basically insinuate that a person was part of a gang culture. It was a derogatory term, although some women really embraced that term, which we'll talk about here in just a little bit. But they had their names dragged through the mud in mainstream publications. And so anyone who was associated with a zoot suit and was a part of the Mexican American community was considered a criminal, a gang member, and in the case of women, they were considered promiscuous, sexually loose. So how then do you go about understanding the actual motivations of people who chose to wear the zoot suit at a time when it was so reviled? When there's no journals, there's no letters, there's no real articulations of people who self-identified as a pachuca or a zoot suiter and who could explain the world as they saw it. So I decided I needed to be creative and try and find more sources. And I knew that a lot of women who wore zoot suits had gotten in trouble with the law, okay? And so I thought, well, you know what? Maybe I can try looking at juvenile court records. Now, as you can imagine, because we're talking about juveniles, these are very confidential records. I had to petition the LA County Juvenile Court, make them understand that I was a historian, I wouldn't use any identifying characteristics, and that this was in order to create a larger story about the Mexican American experience during the war years. And I got in, and these were some of the richest primary sources that I encountered. Lots of interesting stories and narratives. They read almost like a soap opera, because what surprised me is that parents would actually drag their daughters before the court and say, I cannot handle my daughter anymore. She's hanging out with zoot suiters, she's adopting American attitudes about sex, you know, I don't know what to do anymore, please help me. And then you had the daughters saying before the court, I can't take the strict supervision anymore. I just need some freedom, some individuality within my family. And then you had reformers who were saying that these women were race conscious and that they weren't becoming Americanized enough, whereas parents were saying they're becoming too Americanized. So those were really exciting sources, but again, they were mediated by and large by unsympathetic outsiders of the court. And so it was important to me to get further voices of Mexican American women. And so what I decided to do, I had interviewed my aunts formally, I had interviewed their friends, but I decided I needed more voices. And so I started just going to senior centers in East Los Angeles neighborhoods, predominantly Mexican-American neighborhoods, and saying, hey, I'm a grad student, I'd really love to talk to you about your experiences, and trying to convince people, start to build relationships so that people would trust me and my research trajectory. And what I found in these interviews is that Mexican-American women who came of age during World War II, what I was seeing in the juvenile court records corroborated what they were saying, and vice versa. And it also added new insights. So those women that I interviewed that had wore zoot suits in their youth explained a number of different reasons for doing so. So one woman named Maria, who had worn the zoot suit during the war, she said she did so because she never felt accepted into U.S. society. She stated, quote, I felt good dressing like that. I think it's because you felt like people were kind of looking down on you. You didn't feel like you belonged, so we formed our own little group. And my Aunt Ida just liked it because she thought she looked good looking and sharp, and she was in style, and she was proud of the way she looked, and the way she looked when she walked across that graduation stage, even if my grandmother, didn't talk to her for days afterwards. So it became clear to me from the court records, from the interviews, that women who were typically thought to be pachuca, whether or not they identified as such, wore the clothes for a number of different reasons. They wanted to rebel against Mexican social conventions. They wanted to rebel against American social conventions. They wanted to play with their sexuality. They wanted to highlight cultural difference and to challenge these really rigid notions of femininity in their community and their second-class citizenship. Oral histories, though, also told me a lot about some of the material that I was finding in, excuse me, traditional archival sources. So for instance, I went to the Boeing archive, which was formerly Douglas Aircraft, which was a defense industry in Southern California during the war. And here, Mexican-American women worked as riveters, they worked as buckers, so they were defense workers in assembly line. And they typically made a little bit over $1 an hour for their labor, which was actually quite a lot for the time. Because previously Mexican-American women would have never been allowed to work in a well-paying defense job. They had worked as domestics, they had worked in food processing, garment work. But from using these oral histories, what I learned, which I think is even more important, is what this money meant to the young women themselves. So, for Mary Luna, as you see in the quote here, she worked at Douglas Aircraft in El Segundo. It meant that her family could be self-sufficient without the assistance of the federal government. She said, quote, "I remember I went home and my dad was so happy I had gotten a job. That meant we could go off welfare. It was just like somebody gave me $1 million." I also knew from archival materials that about 500,000 Latino service personnel entered the U.S. Armed Forces during the Second World War. But what I wouldn't have known from these written sources is that what this demographic shift meant for the people on the home front, the families. For those women who stayed in their barrios and worked on the home front defense lines. So this was, again, very similar to what I had learned from my own aunts. Virgie Gonzalez, a teenager during the war years, admitted to being quote-unquote wild while her 4 brothers served overseas. And she reveled in the ability to come and go as she pleased, never having to hear her protective older brother say, "You shouldn't be out there, you should be home helping mother wash dishes." "I was more independent," she recalled. My aunt Ernestine Escobedo similarly observed that strict supervision of her and her sister loosened up, her words, during the war, especially with the departure of her eldest brother to the Navy. "He was the one that was the boss," she explained, and so now we were on our own. Likewise, Mimi Lozano recalled that her father took a lucrative defense job far away from her home in Lancaster, or in East Los Angeles, and was working in Lancaster, if you know the Southern California area. Her mom decides to secretly become a car hop at a local restaurant and never tells her husband. You know, and Lozano remembers that the war made it easier for mom to have that kind of freedom. So no matter how much archival work I did on the subject, and it's important that I did that work, it was invaluable. It was really the women's own personal testimonies that made this history come alive. Now, I don't want to make oral history seem all, rosy and the perfect source, because they're just like any other source that you have to cast a critical eye on, right? You're in the moment, you're interviewing someone, it feels very immediate, engaged, and you want to hang on and believe everything this person is saying is true, right? That's natural. But it doesn't mean that everything the interviewee is saying is true. Narrators frequently get names and dates wrong. They recount stories of questionable truthfulness, and in the case of my book, these were women that were trying to learn things 40 to 50 years, or remember things 40 to 50 years after the fact, right? That's a long time to get things right. And so it's very commonplace for interviewees to remember things with nostalgia and romance, and certainly inaccuracies of historical memory. So when I first made phone calls to women that I had met in the senior centers and wanted to follow up and talk to them a bit more before we did an interview, several stated to me, well, I didn't really do much during the war, and I didn't experience any discrimination. We were all united, and I just didn't feel that I ever experienced anything different than any other American, which really made me take a step back and say, well, is this the case, or Or is this how women are choosing to remember their time in the military? How should I think about this in my own research? And of course, once I started actually interviewing the women, there was a much more complicated story. You know, one woman talked about the fact that a hairdresser would never see her, and she couldn't understand why. One Mexican woman remembered that a realtor refused to show her a house, even though she had a down payment from her veteran husband, who was also Mexican American, because it was a predominantly white neighborhood. So these experiences clearly contradicted what the women had shared with me initially before the interview got going. And so it's the job of the historian to look at the research as a whole, right? And to cast a healthy, skeptical eye even on oral histories. And when I did this, I realized that World War II was both a simultaneously limiting and opportune moment for many second-generation daughters, Mexican-American women. They experienced a lot of freedoms, new job opportunities, better pay, but there were also long-standing gender and racial norms that they couldn't escape, and that were still shaping their lives during the war and thereafter. So if I'm going to leave you with one takeaway tonight, before we jump into our next presentation, I think it's really important for all of you to recognize the importance of the stories of your community and of your family members. These are individuals who are historical actors, right, in and of themselves. And again, when I first began looking for women to interview and reaching out to them, most would say when I would first, give them a call, I didn't do anything that out of the ordinary during the war. I think you should talk to somebody else. And I would try to be persistent, but respectful, but really persistent. And eventually individuals would agree to chat with me. And once the tape started rolling, and yes, all of these interviews were on cassette tape, if you even know what those are. I don't know at this point. Their stories began to flow off their tongues. And it became clear that nothing could be further from the truth. They had made a difference during this key moment of national formation in the United States. And so oral histories provide an opportunity for ordinary people, quote unquote ordinary people, to see just how much their life stories matter to history, right? And that's really important, and that's really inspiring. So go out, talk with your elders, talk with your family members, talk with your community. Their personal stories matter to history, and so do yours.
All right. This. All right, so last but not least, I'll be brief to see if we have time for questions later, but I'm seeing so many patterns and themes across the four of us. There will be a quiz at the end, so after this. So looking forward to engaging with that. Okay, so I'll speak a little bit about my work, which I call Belonging in Spanish Heritage Language Learning, Hybrid Literacies for Equitable Pedagogies, and I'll kind of unpack that for you. But first, I'll briefly say why do research, right? So for me, I'm a teaching professor, as you can see in my first slide. So why do I do research if I don't have to, technically, as a teaching professor? I don't have to produce research as part of my job, but I do. Why? So for me, as a linguist, as an educator, research is pedagogical practice. I see research as teaching, teaching as research. I can't really divorce those two. And it is my research that informs how to be a teacher in my field, in my work. And so it is valuable. Also, research is professional positioning, right? I identify as a teacher scholar. And thinking about producing new knowledge around my work is important. And as many of my colleagues, as all of my colleagues tonight have said, research is the way that I give back to the world around me. Specifically in my work, I rely on qualitative methods of research, as we all do in this panel, surprise. And I use sociolinguistic ethnography methods primarily and discourse analysis. And I'll again talk a little bit about what those are and how you can use those to answer specific questions that matter to you. Okay, so I direct the Heritage Speakers program here at DU. You might wonder who is a heritage speaker and what that is. So heritage speakers, in my role, I work with Spanish heritage speakers specifically, but a heritage speaker is any individual who is raised in a home where non-English language is spoken. That student or speaker may speak or barely understand the heritage language and be to some degree bilingual in English and the heritage language. So obviously, we're talking about contexts where English is the majority language, the US, but where many other languages are spoken specifically at home or in communities across the nation, really. So in my work, I try to answer this question. This is kind of what frames the type of projects that I might embark on. And it's the idea of how to make Spanish language educationally accessible and equitable for heritage speakers. So how do we make learning Spanish an equitable and accessible opportunity for all students and not just those learning Spanish as a second language? So this is important because, despite we have traditionally, there's one clue. We're traditionally ignored the experience of Spanish speakers, heritage speakers in the US particularly, as we have conceived ways of teaching Spanish. There's only in the last maybe 50 years or so that scholars and people have asked how do we teach Spanish to students who already bring the language with them and who bring very important, valuable experiences with the language that we have largely ignored. So we noticed too that heritage speakers, specifically in Spanish, consistently have strong connections to the language. They identify as Spanish speakers, as Latino people. It defines their identity. Yet we see that their proficiencies in the way that they perceive they speak the language, they perceive that is somehow deficient, is somehow incorrect. There's a lot of linguistic insecurity. And this contributes to a sense of alienation in their Spanish education traditionally. So certainly this is a problem. And this is kind of how I try to think of, why am I motivated to do this work, is to really close this gap that is so common. Oh yes, I have a very shameless plug. I'll talk a little bit about my work. If you want to know more and you're really into this, get my book. I just came out with a book on this project. I was told you need to talk about the book, so I just talked about the book. Okay, moving on. Okay, great. So how do we close this gap? How do we make Spanish education more equitable, more accessible for all speakers, including specifically heritage speakers? So in my view and based on my work, I know that we need pedagogies that instill a sense of belonging. Belonging as a learner of language. So what do I mean by belonging? In this case, for me, belonging is the ability to connect at a deep personal level within a classroom context where your own practices with literacy, with writing, with reading, with speaking, and your own educational experiences are clearly and explicitly reflected. So I've shown in my work that heritage language practices, that is how we use language, how heritage speakers use language, Spanish specifically, while they're largely hybrid. And what I mean by that is linguistically hybrid, right? So Spanish, English, English, Spanish, and everything in between. They're deemed non-standard. They're actually, they've been shown to leverage access to academic literacy development in Spanish. So there's not a lot of distance between heritage language practices and academic language practices, actually. And I think we need to pay attention to that. Okay, so brief note on literacy, because this is important in terms of how we frame our work as educators, specifically with multilingual students. So I think of literacy through a social approach. So in my view, and in the view of many, many, many scholars before me, our linguistic repertoire is the way that we talk, are the languages we speak. They can't be separated from our social context and its function. Our literacies reflect our experiences, right? It's who we are is what and how we speak. And so literacy isn't just a skill that we learn, right? It's not, I learned to read and to write, right? It's actually a practice, and that is a recurrent, goal-oriented, social situated use of language for meaningful human activity that I developed throughout my time, my life, in social context specifically, right? So if we ignore the socially embedded nature of reading and writing, we're undermining the extent to which we as researchers can examine an individual's complex and complete literacy repertoires. So for me, it's super important to pay attention to heritage language literacies as a core component of what we do in the classroom. But how do we do that? So how can heritage literacy practices, what students are doing with the language already, help us understand how everyday language practices can serve as a resource for academic literacy development? So what I do to answer these questions is I study students. I study heritage speakers of Spanish. I follow them around. It's not creepy, I promise. So specifically in this context of a tutoring program. So when you have a program for Spanish heritage speakers, oftentimes there is a peer-to-peer tutoring component to that. And that's a great context of study in my case, because it's an autonomous academic place where students, heritage speakers, are helping other students and are mobilizing any types of literacy practices that they deem fit for the context. So students would take Spanish courses, they go through the program, and they're hired as tutors to work with other heritage students who are less advanced than they are. They're given an hour, 30 minutes to an hour to work weekly. They meet at a separate room. There's no instructor presence. Nobody's watching them except for me, but they know I'm there. But they just kind of mobilize whatever language practices that they want, whether that is in Spanish or English or whatever. So I'll share with you a couple of illustrations of what to do with that information, how that information has allowed me to study these practices and see the relevance for Spanish education. In this case of a study I did, these are 6 heritage students who were tutors in a tutoring program within a heritage program. Important, obviously, to note that they're all first-generation students. Several of them are transnational students, so they've come back and forth between the U.S. and their country of their families. And that's all I was going to say about that. So all obviously Latino students. Okay, so how have I organized around this question, getting to the answer? So I asked 3 specific questions in this particular project. So I'm interested in seeing what the literacy and linguistic practices that tutors mobilize during the session. So what are they doing with language? And with what goals are they mobilizing such practices? So they're using language how and for what? So for that, I rely on ethnography, methodology, thematic analysis. And then I always want to look at language more specifically. So also important to ask, how do tutors use language to create an academic persona? This is an academic context. So how are students presenting themselves as experts in an academic context? And then how are they also mobilizing these interpersonal stances to create community? For those questions, it's useful, in my opinion, to use discourse analysis methodology. And I'll talk about what these methodologies might look like very briefly to give you an idea of what you can do with this type of data. Okay, so where does data come from? Obviously very important to ask in my case. Video recordings and transcriptions of tutoring sessions, right? So I recorded lots of these sessions and then I watched them and then I transcribed them. and I thought about them a lot, and then analyzed them. I also interviewed tutors to get at opinions about their experience and other topics of interest, and then obviously lots of field notes to have enough data to analyze. Okay, so briefly I will kind of illustrate. I don't have time to show you videos of the interactions. This is kind of what we would do, but I will kind of explain what's going on in this interaction and how you can extrapolate the information, apply the methodology, and come up with an analysis. Okay, so in this case we have, this is what a tutoring session would look like. The tutor is the student with the jacket, and the student is the other person. Okay, so they would be having an interaction. You would look at the data, and you look at patterns of information. So in this case, I was looking at literacy practices. In this case, I saw that across tutoring sessions, there were these practices that would come up over and over again. So talking about social media, students would talk about social media challenges. They would go in and out of English and Spanish, in and out of the content matter, and connect in those ways. Consulting an expert has to do with teaching their students how to ask for help when they don't know the answer. Peer-to-peer academic advising, lots of tutors would also help other students figure out how to apply for grad school, how to find information relevant for their academic trajectories and things like that. And then we have personal storytelling, which I want to kind of briefly illustrate because I think it's maybe the most significant illustration of how efficient and valuable these tutoring sessions were for students. So personal storytelling is when students would tell a personal story to navigate an academic topic or an academic assignment to help illustrate to the student how to think about an assignment. So Esmeralda was telling the student about a breakup story of hers. The student needs to write a linguistic interview, so they had to find a bilingual person to interview and talk about how being bilingual is important in their life. So the student is kind of figuring out, okay, I don't know what to ask a person, like why is this important? And so Esmeralda goes on about her breakup story when she was a teenager. She broke up with her boyfriend, and for weeks she would listen to breakup songs in English, and she's like, whatever, this is not a big deal, I'm okay. And then one day after that, she was walking across the hall, and her mom was blaring breakup songs in Spanish. I think it was, I don't know, Enrique Iglesias or something. And she's like, that moment I stopped and I started bawling. And when I heard that song in Spanish, I connected with my emotions so deeply then, and I didn't do that when I would hear Spanish or English music. And so she's kind of explaining to the student that it is relevant to talk about how you connect to two languages and to think of questions that might be engaging and critical for the student to develop this assignment. So Esmeralda, who is the tutor, she intentionally relies on her translingual storytelling. So this interaction is all in Spanish, English. There's a lot of switches in between. She relies on that particular repertoire to guide her student into critically considering how to write a linguistic biography. And it's effective. In the end, the student feels more empowered to go write that assignment and to do the interview. I'll skip this, but in the interviews too, you can use interviews to really kind of support your claim in the data. So Esmeralda talks about doing this very intentionally. She understands that speaking two languages and going back and forth is actually a way to connect and to help the student. She does it intentionally. Okay, briefly, the second one is another interaction, and I want to show you briefly how you can use discourse analysis to come up with observations and data. And discourse analysis is just a way to look at language. So I'll show you kind of one way to do that. So this is an interaction between Cristal in the blue shirt, and the student is super anxious because she is preparing for the final exam. And she doesn't understand how to write written accents in Spanish. And she's just like, I need help with accents. And so the tutor gets to work, they have an interaction, English, Spanish, Spanish, English, and in the end the student is just like, yes, I get it. So I took that transcription of that interaction and I counted the different numbers of clauses in the interaction. And then I coded for mood. Mood tells us interpersonal positionings in interactions. And so, for example, you can kind of see that both student and tutor produce almost the exact amount of talking, right? So we can see that the tutor is not really doing a lot of the talking as you would expect. You know, like I'm the teacher, you're the student, I'm going to tell you what's going on. So the student is doing a lot of talking, the tutor is also. So you can kind of see that it's very balanced in terms of the talking there, which has significance for the analysis. We also see that the student is producing the most amount of minor clauses. So minor clauses are where you say kind of like, okay, to express that you're following up, right? You're following what the person is saying. You're not negotiating whether they're right or not, right? You're just following along. So the student is quite engaged with Cristal's guiding of the topic, as we can see there. And then finally, in terms of full declarative clauses, these are clauses that we say in conversation to construct ourselves as taking an active initiator role, right? When you want to guide conversation, come up with a topic, etc. The student is doing most of that. So that shows that the student is actually in charge, sort of the session, because she feels so open and comfortable with her tutor to really help her figure out what's going on. So Cristal, the tutor, is embodying a student-oriented approach, just like an educator might do, or a classroom teacher, as she mobilizes a hybrid repertoire, and she empowers her student as a learner. So in my view, there's a lot to learn from these tutors and what they're doing in sessions. And even though they are mobilizing language practices that are non-traditional, there's really a lot of value to that for us to figure out what to do in the classroom. So in my work, I have shown that these heritage language tutors have supported their peers, other students, in many ways. One of that way is supporting their academic literacy development. So supporting other students' understanding of class expectations, grammar topics, literacy skills, writing, etc. They're also offering regard for their peers' academic challenges as young college students, first generation mostly, and Latino students. And they've also consistently supported community building within the program. They're facilitating the access of norms of academic life that are often invisible for first generation students. And they intentionally build in a collective experience for learning. So relying on these non-traditional autonomous spaces for heritage speakers, I think is crucial. So it's not just interesting, clearly, but I think it is very important to create these spaces, to pay attention to them, and to figure out how they can teach us about pedagogy. So for many heritage students, school-like literacy practices, right, academic language, formal language, they're not necessarily representative of the many productive literacy practices that they're already encountering in their daily life outside of school. If we move beyond the conception of academic literacy as just the language of school, and if we consider how students themselves already mobilize language in service of their learning of academic norms or language, it is imperative for belonging. If we recognize and valorize and study these multiple mobile and hybrid linguistic practices, these are crucial steps in understanding how to meet the linguistic and pedagogical needs of linguistically diverse students, such as Spanish heritage speakers. So paying attention to what's already going on with language, I think, is important as we figure out how to best teach Spanish to heritage speakers specifically. So in my work, I strive to kind of close this gap between, feeling so identified by your language, but feeling so alienated from the way that you develop that language, and actually create classrooms and spaces where students can see themselves reflected in these literacy practices that the professor is maybe mobilizing, that their classmates is mobilizing. And so that results in a sense of belonging and connection throughout their language learning experience. I can talk about pedagogy, I'm not going to do that, but the larger implication of this work is, again, to contribute to models of language teaching for educators of Spanish that are interested in engaging with heritage speakers, heritage learners of Spanish, because we are going to have more and more heritage speakers in classrooms happily. So yeah, I'm happy to answer questions about it later, but that's all I have for you today. Thanks.
So thanks to all of you. These were such wonderful talks about such related topics, and we'd like to start with some questions now, whether it's about writing, about research, something that all of the panelists might perhaps be able to talk to, or one of them. Anybody want to start? And then Rob is going to, did you want to walk around with a microphone? I don't know if this one, does this one disconnect? You can come up here and see, but anyway, if you talk loud, we'll be able to hear you. So, anybody, questions? Yes.
Thank you all for presenting, and I have more time, but I wanted to just ask Kelly in particular, but maybe everyone could respond to. I was thinking about how you mentioned your sort of being afraid of how your community might respond to your research, and I was wondering if there was a way that you share your research with the community, either in feedback or in writing for them specifically as your audience.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's really complicated because what ends up happening is that the tribal government has ideas about what I should and should not be doing versus the community having ideas about what I should and should not be doing. And I always bank on the community because tribal council comes and goes, right? So one thing that I do is just make sure I listen a lot and make sure that I am writing about the things that are important. But even the research that I'm talking about now, I got a cease and desist / we're going to censor your work from the tribal attorney general because I wanted to talk to people when I applied for my second IRB there. I wanted to talk to people who were not on the roll but were petitioning to be on the roll. And so there is a lot of tension there that I kind of have to dance around. Usually I do send it out I send out work before it's published to people who participated in the study or who I really rely on their sort of feedback and opinions, but mostly people just find it randomly online and chase me down at powwows and other community events to be like, we read your book online, and I'm always like, you did? And it has never been anything other than wonderful and pleasant and super supportive, but I'm always afraid.
Okay, wonderful. Other questions?
Hi there. I have more of a historical question than a rhetorical question, if it's okay. This whole time that you guys were talking about the historical implications of rhetoric in the United States, I was thinking, I went to a small middle school in Kentucky, and during middle schools, usually when you start talking about like race in the United States, and I was thinking, like, what is it going to take for Indigenous American history and African American history to be taught as just U.S. history, and like, how does that trickle down happen, I guess, and yeah, those are my general questions.
I was just going to say that could be your PhD. Yeah. You just found the topic of research.
That's actually a really difficult question to answer. I will say though that I think when you think about sociology, a lot of times the story is negative. But I will say that there is a movement toward sort of more inclusive pedagogies, right? There are some funders that support inclusive pedagogies. There are certain schools that sort of adopt that philosophy. And so I think it's a slow process because, as I said, with racial progress, it's not linear. And so even though we have people who are of that mindset, there are, of course, movements that are trying to ban critical race theory, trying to ban sort of discussions of DEI more generally. And so with a lot of work, I think is the answer. But of course, it's going to take quite a bit of time.
I was just going to add too that I think it's important to think about the connection between teaching and research, right? A lot of the times we think that research has no implications for, or is a different thing that we do than teaching. And I think a lot of it is action research work has a lot of implications for change in the classroom, changing curriculum, including student voices, including teacher voices, oral narratives. That's the kind of work I think that can make a difference, but it requires, you know, scholars who are engaged with that. Like maybe you're going to be trying.
Okay, other questions?
Okay, of course, I have to talk. May I? My sweet dear friends and colleagues, you make me so happy. It's just so magnificent to be hearing you talk about your research and about yourselves. And so I guess the question I would like to perhaps entertain now with you is the very question of writing and power. And indeed, Kelly, you were just saying that you're taking an awful lot of risks to actually tell the story of your very people who've been so oppressed. And you realize all the intricacies of taking the risk to tell those stories that haven't been told, that need to be told. And so if you would share with us a little bit about, you know, the powers that be, where are those powers, and the resistance, where is that resistance coming from? And also the fears associated with what it is that you are researching, what it is you are attempting to talk about, which is not highly recognized day in and day out, and hasn't been for centuries. Is that a good question?
I can chime in. I mean, you make a really good point, and I think one of the things, in addition to just really feeling strongly about the fact that, again, my father's side of the family deserved as much presence in history books as my mother's side of the family. But I think, too, it has implications if you think about sort of the ways, in my case, my research focuses on Mexicans and Mexican Americans. And so often, when we listen to rhetoric about immigration and rhetoric about people from Mexico, it's, you know, these are individuals who are outsiders and foreigners and not deserving of a place and a sense of belonging in the United States. And what knowing this history empowers us to do is to say, we've always been here. And we belong here just as much as anyone else. And we've, again, been a part of these key moments of national formation for this country. And deserve to have our stories told within the historical record as part of U.S. history. And that's something that drives me, is sort of challenging those stereotypes about who belongs and who should be considered American and worthy of first-class citizenship.
Yeah, and then just that resonates a lot with what I do. It's just a different context, right? So for me, it's the voices that have not been heard in the classroom, Spanish classroom specifically, right? The experiences, stories, feelings, you know, trauma, celebration of many, 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 many people who we just have not really looked at because that's not who a Spanish-speaking speaker is. So I think, you know, finding that very, that problem that just makes you want to go, no, you know, like, just, no, that's not okay. It's huge, I think, for this work, and I think that was clear in everybody's presentation. You know, we all have a little bit of you know, anger, not just anger, but, you know, just like we want change, we need change, passion, you know, hope for the future. And that's just huge in this sort of, in all our work.
Wonderful. Well, that's a wonderful question to end with. We unfortunately are out of time, but you can continue maybe the discussion informally over this wonderful food that is still left